Today on Global Glimpse, we unpack a dramatic shift unfolding inside the United States Senate, where a growing bipartisan rebellion is challenging leadership and demanding long-term budget reforms after years of short-term fixes, stopgap spending bills, and last-minute shutdown threats that have come to define Washington's inability to govern effectively. And as this insurgent coalition of moderates, fiscal hawks, and institutional reformers gains momentum, the Senate finds itself pulled into a high-stakes confrontation over how America funds its government, manages national debt, and plans for the future. The group composed of Democrats who are tired of governing from crisis to crisis and Republicans frustrated by leadership's reliance on temporary continuing resolutions is pushing for a sweeping overhaul that would fundamentally change the budgeting process, restore multi-year planning, strengthen spending caps, and create automatic fallback systems to prevent shutdowns, a proposal that has unexpectedly ignited fierce pushback from leadership in both parties, who fear that such reforms could weaken their leverage, complicate negotiations, and shift power away from the top toward rank-and-file lawmakers. Inside the Capitol, tensions are rising as this bipartisan faction argues that Congress has become addicted to deadline brinkmanship, using shutdown threats as bargaining chips rather than fulfilling its basic constitutional duty to fund the government responsibly. And they point to a decade of near-constant fiscal standoff siege, one damaging public trust and undermining the nation's global economic standing as evidence that the status quo is unsustainable. Their reform blueprint includes a mandatory 2-year budgeting cycle, automatic temporary funding to avoid shutdowns, independent scoring reviews to prevent misleading budget math, and stricter rules to keep unrelated policy riders out of spending bills, arguing that these changes would stabilize federal operations, give agencies time to plan, and reduce political chaos. Leadership, however, is resisting strongly, warning that such reforms could deprive Congress of essential negotiating tools, reduce legislative flexibility, and shift too much influence to committees rather than party leaders who rely on the current system to manage internal divisions. Some also argue that automatic funding would allow future Congresses to avoid hard decisions on spending cuts or revenue increases. The rebellion is especially notable because it brings together senators who rarely align centrist. Democrats who want predictable social program funding, Republicans worried about rising deficits, and independents who have long criticized both parties for failing to modernize the budget process. And their unified messaging is starting to resonate with a public increasingly angry about government dysfunction. Recent polls show Americans across party lines want long-term solutions rather than repeated shutdown scares, and business groups, credit analysts, and former federal budget directors have all warned that Washington's crisis-driven approach is undermining national stability, raising borrowing costs, and weakening economic competitiveness. As this bipartisan bloc gains confidence, it is leveraging the current funding negotiations to force leadership to address their demands, threatening to withhold votes on upcoming spending measures unless reform talks begin immediately. A move that could disrupt the fragile majority margins in the Senate and complicate House negotiations. Already burdened by internal divisions and far-right pressure, the White House, meanwhile, has issued cautious support for structural improvements without fully endorsing the coalition's proposals, reflecting the administration's desire to maintain bargaining flexibility while acknowledging the public's frustration with repeated funding crises. Outside Congress, policy experts argue that long-term reform is not just desirable, but urgently needed, noting that federal agencies from the Pentagon to public health to infrastructure cannot plan effectively when funding arrives in unpredictable bursts, often months late, and that even short shutdowns inflict long-lasting operational damage. Still, skeptics warn that budget reform is notoriously difficult, as past attempts have collapsed under political pressure. Disagreements over spending priorities and fears that changes could backfire during partisan swings. The stakes of this growing rebellion are enormous. If successful, the coalition could force the first major restructuring of the federal budget system in decades, potentially reshaping how Congress allocates trillions of dollars each year and how much fiscal discipline future lawmakers must exercise. If it fails, the Senate may simply drift back into its cycle of short-term patches, temporary deals, and repeated brinkmanship, leaving the underlying problems unresolved. With leadership scrambling to contain the uprising, With reformers holding firm and with the next funding deadline looming, Washington is bracing for a showdown that could determine not just the outcome of this year's budget, but the future of congressional governance itself. This is Global Glimpse, bringing clarity to the forces reshaping American politics. Stay informed, stay curious, and join us tomorrow for another essential deep dive.